Welcome everyone to another episode of In a Nutshell. And this week we're delighted to have Dr. Mark Messina as a guest. Dr. Messina is a Senior Research Fellow of Soy Nutrition Institute Global and an Adjunct Associate Professor at Loma Linda University. He has dedicated his career to studying the health effects of soya foods and has published over 125 articles and book chapters over his 3 decades of work in the field. Dr. Messina is also the chairperson of the Editorial Advisory Board for the Soya Connection and has organised and chaired numerous international symposia on soya's role in preventing and treating chronic disease. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Messina.
Thank you very much. That 3 decades always bothers me because it's approaching 4, and that seems like a long time.
Oh, yeah, I sympathise with that. It's time is running so fast. Big welcome from me. And can I ask you, first of all, as Daisy said, you've spent these 3 coming on to 4 decades researching soya foods. So what was it that first drew you to soya as perhaps a scientific and public health focus?
Well, it's an interesting story because I've been eating tofu since 1972. And I started eating tofu because my martial arts instructor, I was really big in the martial arts, said that if I became a vegetarian, my martial arts would improve. Now, I think that's ridiculous, but I was 19 and had no formal education in nutrition. So fast forward a number of years, after I got my PhD, I began working at the National Cancer Institute in Washington, D.C., and a soon-to-be colleague presented a paper which showed that adding soybeans to the diets of rats inhibited chemically induced mammary cancer. The head of the National Cancer Institute saw that report. He wrote the branch I was working in and asked if anybody there was interested in doing something with soy. So the secretary of the branch happened to see that note, and she said, well, you eat tofu, why don't you do something? So that's how I actually got into the field.
Right. So maybe we can sort of ask you then a bit more about, from a nutritional standpoint, what have you found makes soya unique compared, say, to just other beans?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm a big fan of beans. My wife is a dietitian. She specializes in plant-based diets. So we have beans every day. Even if you don't eat soy, you can have a really healthy plant-based diet. Just beans are quite important. But soy is really unique from a macronutrient perspective because it's higher in protein than other beans. Most beans are about 25% protein on a caloric basis. Soybeans are up around 35% protein. So there's a big difference there. But even more importantly, soybeans are actually quite high in fat. About 40% of the calories in soybeans are derived from fat. In a food like tofu, it's about 50%, whereas most beans are fat-free. So it has a very different macronutrient composition. The soy protein, the protein from soybeans and other soy foods, is also quite interesting because it's been known really since 1967 that soy protein directly lowers blood cholesterol levels. So this is a direct effect of the protein, not because soy foods tend to be high in polyunsaturated fat. But I actually entered the field because of my interest in isoflavones. I think isoflavones may have a number of benefits, which obviously we will discuss. And if you're interested in isoflavones, that means you're interested in soy foods. Because although isoflavones are present in actually a wide range of foods, except for soybeans and foods made from soybeans, they're present in very negligible amounts. So if you eat a diet that is high in soy, it's high in isoflavones. If you don't eat soy, it's essentially devoid of isoflavones. And you can really see that point when you look at the average isoflavone intake of sort of native Japanese consuming a traditional diet. It's about 40 milligrams per day. In the US and Europe, UK, it's probably fewer than 3 milligrams per day.
So you mentioned cholesterol there, but is it possible at this point to just give us an overview of where we're headed in terms of this podcast and what would be the overall health benefits of eating soya?
Yeah, again, I think the cholesterol reduction is probably the most well-established. It might be the least exciting, but it's the most well-established because it's easy to measure changes in blood cholesterol levels. And it's been estimated that as a result of the direct effect of the protein, and then if you end up replacing animal sources of protein in your diet, which tend to be high in saturated fat, with soy foods because of the change in the fatty acid composition of the diet, you're also going to lower your cholesterol. So if you add those two factors together, the protein and the change in fatty acid intake, you may end up getting a 7 to 8% reduction in blood cholesterol levels. And then, according to some equations, over a long period of time, that could reduce risk of coronary heart disease anywhere from maybe 8 to 10 or more percent. So I think that is certainly an important benefit of soybeans. And then the protein itself is also very high quality, as you know. I mean, it's a misnomer, but plant proteins are commonly referred to as incomplete proteins. That's a ridiculous way to refer to any protein, because all the proteins contain all of the essential amino acids. As you know, it's just that some are relatively low relative to biological requirements in comparison to animal proteins. But the quality of soy protein is very similar to the quality of animal protein. When you eat soy foods, you're not getting all the saturated fat. But again, from my perspective, it's the very exciting possibilities that isoflavones may exert a number of health benefits, everything from reducing breast cancer risk if you consume soy foods very early in life, that's, childhood, teenage years, to perhaps improving cognitive function. There was just a systematic review published looking at the effects of soy foods and isoflavones on cognition, and it seems to improve memory in older individuals.
Right. So, we think that sounds really impressive. So I want to ask you, given that the dietary guidelines were recently updated in the US just at the beginning of January, obviously legumes are mentioned, but do you think that there is currently enough emphasis on legumes? And within that, would you be separating soya out in particular?
I wish everybody could see your face when you said that legumes were mentioned, because, technically they are, but for a long time, the dietary guidelines have de-emphasized the importance of legumes. And it's because they're so infrequently consumed. It's so disappointing. They are such wonderful foods. First of all, economically, they're relatively inexpensive. As we've already talked, they're pretty high in protein, high in fiber. They're just great, very nutritious foods, and that they're rarely consumed. In the US, I think the average intake is about 1/10 of a serving per day. And I'm not sure the dietary guidelines emphasizing legumes to a greater extent. In my view, the current guidelines are lacking in a number of areas, and we can talk about that a little bit. But dietitians, health professionals promote bean, pulse, legume consumption, but it's just not something that actually many non-Asians tend to consume. Of course, in South America, beans are more common, and in Asia, other regions of the world, but not in much of the higher income countries.
And I think part of that, well, certainly in the UK, when we go in and talk to even medical students about soya, it's quite difficult to persuade them. And one of the reasons is that there's so much debate about whether there's any risks to consuming soya, what are the benefits. Can we get into a little bit about why it actually seems to generate so much confusion and perhaps controversy in the public?
Yeah, it's not perhaps. Soy foods are very controversial. Between 1990 and roughly around 2000, the perception of soy foods that they were completely beneficial. And it was a very exciting time. A lot of research was being published. And then to a large extent, beginning in about 1998, with the publication of a study in mice, which showed that the isoflavones in soybeans might actually stimulate the growth of existing mammary tumors that were estrogen sensitive. I think health professionals, researchers, and the public began to be concerned more about the fact that isoflavones were and are commonly classified as phytoestrogens. And I think those of us in the field made somewhat of a mistake in the mid-1990s, because these compounds, isoflavones, are commonly referred to as phytoestrogens, but we didn't do a sufficiently good job in explaining that the isoflavones are different from the hormone estrogen, both clinically, how they affect tissues, and at the molecular level, how they bind to estrogen receptors. And it was only really over a period of years that we learned how different isoflavones are from the hormone estrogen. You have to really look at the clinical outcomes to determine what isoflavones are actually doing. And fortunately, there are literally hundreds of trials upon which we can reach conclusions. And there was just a really nice paper published last year by researchers from the University of Toronto. I was a minor co-author on that paper, just for transparency's sake. But it was a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And we looked at whether isoflavones in soy foods or soy foods themselves affected 4 endpoints that are affected by the hormone estrogen. So we looked at follicle stimulating hormone levels, estrogen levels, a vaginal maturation index, and endometrial thickness. Neither isoflavones nor soy affected any of those markers. All 4 of those markers are affected by the hormone estrogen. So that's really, it's a great paper because it shows so clearly at the clinical level that they're different. In 1996, it was the second estrogen receptor was identified, estrogen receptor beta. So that really changed how researchers viewed ligands or molecules that would bind estrogen receptors, because now there was a second receptor identified. And 2 years later, it was shown that isoflavones preferentially bind to estrogen receptor beta versus estrogen receptor alpha, whereas estrogen binds and activates both receptors equally. And that is important. That preferential binding to estrogen receptor beta is potentially quite important, because when you activate estrogen receptor beta, it tends to have a anti-proliferative effect, whereas activating estrogen receptor alpha has a proliferative effect on cells. But in the end, we don't have a complete understanding of what goes on at the molecular level. I mean, there are co-activators and co-repressors, and how compounds bind to the chromosome determine the effect on tissues. So what I always try to emphasize is just look at what happens to cholesterol levels, blood pressure, cancer risk, if you're looking at markers of cancer risk. So look at the clinical data.
That's great. If someone's quite new to the area and they might even be saying, Dr. Messina, what is an isoflavone? Can we just go back a step and just clarify what exactly is the isoflavone?
Yeah, isoflavones are naturally occurring plant compounds. They are able to bind to estrogen receptors because the distance between the 2 main hydroxyl groups in isoflavones are similar to the distance in estrogen, so they can bind to estrogen receptors. Interestingly, they are synthesized by the plant because they are phytoalexins. So they are always present to varying degrees, but in times of stress, the isoflavone levels actually increase. So you can change the isoflavone content of a soybean by changing the growing conditions, reducing moisture, changing the amount of light, pesticide formation. So a lot of the phytochemicals are like that, and they're produced by the plant for the plant's benefit, but in many cases, it looks like eating those plants that contain these phytoalexins or phytochemicals benefits humans.
That's so interesting. I never knew that. So can you change the isoflavone content depending on how you cook the soybean, or is it just about how it's grown?
Well, the main thing is how it's grown. So if you look at different varieties, I mean, you can see 4, 5-fold differences in the thousands of different varieties of soybeans that exist. You do lose some isoflavones. There's a bit of a debate within the research community about where isoflavones are lost during processing. But from a practical perspective, one important observation is that the concentrated sources of protein that are often used to make soy burgers, for example, or soy protein isolate that you would just maybe use as a supplement, they tend to be lower in isoflavone content than traditional Asian soy foods. Now, I still like those products. Great source of protein. They lower cholesterol levels, and they make a basis for a lot of foods that I consume. So you can actually come up with a pretty decent estimate of the isoflavone content of a traditional Asian soy food if you know the amount of protein it provides, because there are about 3 to 4 milligrams of isoflavones, per gram of protein. So if you consume a cup of soy milk made from whole soybeans, maybe that's going to have 7 grams of protein. So 7 times 3.5, you're going to get about 25 milligrams of isoflavones. So I like to think there are about 25 milligrams of isoflavones in a serving of a traditional soy food. Most of the intervention studies intervene with about at least 50 milligrams of isoflavones. So that would be about 2 servings. And that actually is my own intake recommendation if you're interested in ingesting isoflavones because of their potential health benefits. In terms of something like isolated soy protein or soy protein concentrate, again, those can be used as supplements or the basis for burgers. Instead of 3 to 4 milligrams per gram of protein, they maybe have 1 to 2 milligrams per gram of protein. So there's still going to be a source of isoflavones, but generally a lower concentration than traditional soy foods.
We still see in social media that soya somehow feminizes men and gives men breast tissue.
Let's do the mammary cancer or breast cancer concern first, then get to male feminization. So absolutely, the origins of the breast cancer controversy, 100% due to research published by the University of Illinois researchers in the States. First study was published in 1998. That study showed that if you implant breast cancer cells into a mouse and then you give isoflavones, you see a stimulation in tumor size. And that's scary. I mean, that's animal studies carried less weight among scientists than human studies for obvious reasons, but they are part of the scientific literature. And that was in 1998 before a lot of the human research was actually conducted. But what we know now is that when you actually give isoflavones or soy foods to healthy women, women with breast cancer, women at high risk of breast cancer, you don't see any adverse changes. So for example, 14 studies have evaluated the effects of isoflavone exposure on breast tissue density. So you would measure that with a mammogram. Breasts that are more dense are more likely to develop tumors. They're also harder to detect, but they also are more likely to develop tumors. No effect on breast tissue density. You can also take a biopsy of the breast to look to see how quickly cells are replicating. The quicker the cells replicate, the more likely they are to develop or be transformed into cancer cells because they have less time to repair any DNA damage that is occurring all the time. So none of those 6 studies showed any adverse effects of isoflavone. So the clinical evidence is remarkably supportive of the safety of isoflavones, regardless of the health status of a woman. So the clinical data are very supportive of safety. Now, interestingly, the observational data suggests that post-diagnosis soy intake actually reduces recurrence and improves survival. So we're not talking randomized controlled trials, we're talking observational studies. They're cohort studies, and there have only been 4 or 5 conducted, but we're looking at soy intake after diagnosis of breast cancer. And the position of the American Cancer Society is that soy foods likely reduces recurrence. The World Cancer Research Fund International identified soy foods as one of 5 factors that may reduce mortality from breast cancer. So we've really gone from a situation in the 1990s, late 1990s, where the animal research was suggesting that soy might be harmful to women with breast cancer, to the current situation where the clinical data supported the safety but no benefit. The observational studies actually are suggestive of benefit. And by the way, what I just said is one reason why I think to reduce breast cancer risk via soy consumption, it should be consumed very early in life. Because as I noted, soy was not inhibiting breast cell proliferation. It had no effect. And it was not decreasing breast tissue density. So I'm at a bit of a loss for what the mechanism would be for how soy would reduce breast cancer development. However, there's a hypothesis that was proposed in 1995, so it's been around a long time, suggesting that consuming just as little as 1 serving per day during childhood, teenage years is enough to markedly reduce breast cancer risk later on in life. It's thought, but it's pure speculation, that the exposure to estrogen during the developing breast actually changes the cells in the breast in a way that makes them permanently less likely to be transformed into a cancer cell later on in life. And interestingly, in this case, isoflavones may actually be acting like an estrogen agonist as opposed to an anti-estrogen. Interestingly, becoming pregnant very early in life during the teenage years also markedly reduces risk of developing breast cancer, maybe because of the surge in estrogen exposure when pregnant. So as I often kid, you can either recommend from a public health perspective that teenagers become pregnant or that they consume soy food. So you do the math on that one.
I know which one I'd prefer if I had a teenage daughter, that's for sure. So that's interesting. So just to really hammer the point, not only are we saying that soya is safe for women of all ages and stages, but also has benefits, and even for women with breast cancer may reduce their recurrence.
Yeah, it's a big may, because again, it's hard to reach definitive conclusions in the field of nutrition once you get past vitamin deficiency causes scurvy, because we're always reaching conclusions, making assessments on imperfect data. But if all you knew was that the clinical data were without any inconsistency supportive of safety and the observational data were suggestive of benefit, you would definitely be recommending that all women consume soy, including women with breast cancer.
That's a really good point, because women with breast cancer can be reassured of the safety and know they're getting the additional benefits for, as you said, with the cholesterol reduction and everything else that soya protein.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because at least in the States, I haven't looked at the statistic in a while, but the average age of diagnosis of breast cancer is 62, whereas for prostate cancer, it's 72. So, they always say for prostate cancer, men are going to die with their tumors rather than of their tumors. For breast cancer, women are going to live a really long time. I mean, they're only 62 years of age. So they have to focus not just on doing something to reduce the risk of recurrence, improve their survival, but overall health. And I think that's where soy food can have a really important role. Now, just to sort of end this discussion on breast cancer, one of the big questions that the cancer agencies in general often ignored. So in a paper that I co-authored recently, we identified 10 statements by 10 different cancer organizations relating to soy consumption by women with breast cancer. All of them, or 9 out of 10, said it's perfectly fine, but only 2 of them actually commented on soy consumption while being treated for breast cancer. And because I'm not a breast cancer expert, but you can be treated for 5 to 10 years with tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitors. That's a really important question. So epidemiologist and I recently looked at the data, and we concluded that, yes, even if you're on aromatase inhibitors or tamoxifen, soy foods can be safely consumed.
Okay, that's really useful to know. I have a lot of patients on those medications, and so I think that would be really welcome news for them as well.
I just want to make this point, which is that you can have a happy life without soy. I've already mentioned that before. And if a woman is concerned about soy and wants to really feel like she's in control, and that's avoiding soy is something that makes her feel safer, I'm all for that. I mean, you can get all the protein, all the nutrients you need without consuming soy foods, but they are extremely versatile. And they make, I think, eating a plant-based diet much, much easier. That's certainly my personal experience. And, they do have some unique benefits with the cholesterol-lowering effects, the really healthy fat. I think, although I don't know to what extent this is true in the UK, but certainly there's a controversy about seed oils these days. And I actually think that I and a couple other folks are working on it's like a 40,000 word manuscript on this topic. I actually think that the potential benefits of linoleic acid, the essential omega-6 fatty acid, are actually underappreciated. So in contrast to this controversy out there about diets being too high in linoleic acid maybe being potentially harmful, I think that there are some benefits that people are not even talking about, like cognitive function. And I won't go into that. I know we don't have time, but soy is a great source of really healthy fat.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. We look forward to hearing your work on that.
Okay.
We didn't really talk very much about bone health in terms of women's health. Is that one of the benefits for postmenopausal women in soy?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I will. It's one of the more disappointing aspects of my relationship to soy foods, because there was really the first animal study indicating that isoflavones may benefit bones was published in 1996. The first clinical trial was published in 1998. So we're going back a lot of years. And even now, when you look at the systematic reviews, and there's probably at least one or two published each year, they tend to conclude that isoflavones either reduce bone loss or improve bone density or favorably affect bone resorption, bone formation, something good about isoflavones and bones. And I had a ton of slides on this topic. They were very nice looking, and I always enjoyed discussing this because it sort of made sense that isoflavones may have these benefits. But over a period of several years in like the mid 2000s to about 2011, there were 4 large trials published. So I'm talking long trials, large trials, at least 2 to 3 years in duration, large sample size. And out of those 4 trials, only one showed that isoflavones reduce bone loss or increase bone density. That was a study coincidentally published at the University of Messina. It's a genetic connection, not any personal one. So I don't know what to make of it, because you really need to go out for 2 to 3 years if you're going to reach a robust conclusion about a skeletal benefit. So I'm on the fence. My attitude with a lot of this is that because soy is a really nutritious food, just when you just look at, micronutrients and macronutrients, and it's easy to incorporate into the diet, you only need a couple of reasons to make it part of your diet. And then if it turns out that there are skeletal benefits and a reduction in breast cancer risk or prostate cancer, that's sort of icing on the cake in my view.
Yeah, no, totally. We have a brand here in the UK that's calcium set tofu. So the actual quantity of calcium is so high. I think, well, that's going to be great for my bone health. It's a really easy way to get plant calcium, isn't it?
And just to follow up on that, that's a really good point, because obviously because of phytates and oxalates in plant foods, a food like spinach is really high in calcium, but it's so poorly absorbed. Whereas studies going back 2002 for tofu, 2005 for soy milk, this is so fascinating, despite the fact that soy is actually high in oxalate and phytate, calcium absorption from soy milk and tofu, calcium set tofu, is actually similar to the absorption of calcium from cow's milk.
Yeah, perfect. That's good to know.
Yep. I don't want to forget the male feminization.
No, I haven't forgotten.
Okay.
Definitely coming back to that. I was going to say we've covered a lot of women's health. Shall we come on to men's health? Because there's that, and there's obviously prostate as well. We'd like to ask you about both, if possible.
Sure. Okay. Let's do the male feminization thing. So conceptually, it obviously made a lot of sense to be a little concerned, because you identify estrogen as the female reproductive hormone, testosterone the male reproductive hormone, and there's a lot of discussion in general about falling sperm counts, male infertility, and estrogenization, of men. You see that on certain social media sites about men are being exposed to estrogen and we're all becoming too feminine. But what really kicked this off was an article in a very popular men's magazine in the US called Men's Health, and that was in 2009. And it was all about soy, and it was entitled, "Is this the most dangerous food in the world for men?" So that really started the entire controversy. They discussed at that time a case report of a 60-year-old man who did in fact develop feminizing characteristics, probably because of his soy consumption. Now, the kicker was that he was consuming 360 milligrams of isoflavones per day. If you recall, average intake in Japan is about 40. So he was consuming 9 times more isoflavones than a typical Japanese consuming a traditional diet would. Furthermore, he was getting those isoflavones from foods. And if you're consuming that much soy, despite its wonderful food, you may be nutrient deficient. Certainly, you're not going to be consuming what health professionals would consider to be an overall well-balanced diet. So that was a case report. There were a couple other studies that were mentioned in that article that really started this controversy. Interestingly, so that was 2009. In 2015, that same magazine talked about the value of soy and said, as long as you don't consume more than 4 servings of soy foods per day, feminizing effects are not a concern. Well, nobody should be consuming more than 4 servings of soy per day. I mean, my gosh, there are a lot of other foods. You don't want to emphasize any one food too much, no matter how healthful it is. And then in 2019, that same magazine actually apologized for the earlier take on tofu. And they actually had an article, "Is tofu the new king of protein?" So it took them 10 years, but I guess they finally came around, but the damage was done. I mean, it's really been brutal. Fortunately, we now have, for example, a meta-analysis, 41 randomized controlled trials published in 2018 that showed that soy had no effect on testosterone levels, free or total testosterone, no effect on 2 forms of estrogen. And so you have to look at both estrogen and testosterone, because older men actually make more estrogen than women do. So it's important to look at both. So no adverse effect on hormone levels. Then there was a meta-analysis published, I think in 2021, showing that soy protein increased or caused gains in muscle mass and strength in those engaged in resistance exercise training to the same extent as whey and other animal proteins. So by and large, and then 2 studies, have looked at gynecomastia, breast tenderness, breast enlargement, because that was one of the symptoms of that case report. The man developed gynecomastia. And the one study went for 3 years, the other one for 3 months, large doses of isoflavones, no effect in gynecomastia. And then 3 studies, clinical trials, have looked at the effects of soy and isoflavones and on sperm or semen parameters, and no adverse effects were noted in those trials.
Yeah. We've just got to keep working at getting that message out there and trying to reverse that damage from, one article, like you say, one case study.
Yeah, especially because, as you mentioned, the U.S. dietary guidelines, although it's normally not their charge, they recommended consuming 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, whereas the RDA in the U.S. and most other places is 0.8 grams, so 50 to 100% increase in protein. At the same time, they said that you should limit saturated fat to no more than 10% of your caloric intake, which has been the recommendation for many decades. And if you look at that reverse pyramid they came out with, it's all about animal products. And I've done some, simple calculations. If you're consuming animal products as your primary source of protein, it is virtually impossible to stay within the 10% caloric intake recommendation. In fact, on a 2,000 calorie diet, if you consume 3 cups of whole milk, which is what they're recommending, it's like you're already 6 to 7% of your calories are in the form of saturated fat. So here with soy foods, you have a food that's higher in protein than other beans. The quality is better, and it's really low in saturated fat. So I think for men, for everybody trying to get more protein without the saturated fat, soy foods are an obvious choice.
Yeah. And it's great to see athletes and bodybuilders, vegan bodybuilders online now, building great physiques with soya protein.
I agree. I think that's really good. Just one point, for the key to building muscle and strength and maintaining it is it's not about protein. It's about resistance exercise training. So you get most of your bang for the buck by just resistance exercise training. Probably extra protein will help a little bit. I think probably protein type is, at that point, if you're getting enough protein, it's probably really a minor consideration. So I think one of the really well-known researchers in the field often gives the analogy where if you have a cake with a icing on the top, the cake is resistance exercise training. icing is, more protein. And I've added to that, the cherry on the icing might be protein type. But it's really about exercise that matters.
Yeah, no, thank you for that reminder. We've both got weights at home, haven't we, Claire? Trying to get those weight training in.
Everybody's got weights at home. It's whether you use them.
That's funny.
I think mine are almost in screenshot, actually.
Oh, brilliant. And then, so just continuing on the theme of men's health, can we ask you about prostate and prostate cancer links?
Yeah, so this is another one of those disappointing areas for me because there was so much emphasis initially on women's health. I mean, we haven't talked about hot flashes. I do think that soy alleviates hot flashes, isoflavones, probably 50 milligrams per day, about 2 servings is what you need. We published a meta-analysis in 2012 that you can look at if you want more information on that topic. So there was, it was all about women. It was hot flash alleviation, bone health in postmenopausal women, preventing breast cancer, even the cognitive function research and memory. There were a systematic review and meta-analysis of 16 randomized controlled trials that showed an improvement in memory. But out of those, something like 1,400 participants in those trials, it's like 1,300 were postmenopausal women. So men haven't been researched to the same extent. That's actually the opposite of usually how it is in trials overall. So I was very excited about prostate because there was, first of all, prostate cancer rates are low in Japan relative to non-Asian high-income countries, just like breast cancer rates are. Of course, those kind of ecological data are good for generating hypotheses, but obviously not for reaching any meaningful conclusions. The issue isn't whether Japan has a lower rate of breast or prostate cancer than the US or the UK. It's whether men in Japan who consume soy have a lower rate of prostate cancer than men in Japan who don't consume soy. But early on, there was some really exciting work suggesting that isoflavones decrease prostate-specific antigen levels. It's a protein produced by the prostate. You can measure it in the blood. So it's pretty exciting. So I was very optimistic that soy would do something for prostate cancer. Then a couple of trials were published, and these were longer trials, and there was no indication of a benefit with respect to PSA or progression of prostate cancer. And the field has really lost a lot of momentum as a result of those 2 trials. And some of the epi data, it's a little bit mixed. So I think more research is justified, but it's an area that unfortunately I'm probably a little bit less excited about. I think it's probably harder to get funding for that area of research. But one of the really important points is, as I sort of alluded to before, is that men tend to be diagnosed with prostate cancer later on in life, and most prostate cancers are very slow growing. So there's, as you know, there's a big debate among oncologists about when to treat and when not to treat men with elevated PSA, even whether to do an MRI and a prostate biopsy, and then if the biopsy comes back, depending on the Gleason score and other factors, whether you treat, it's really hard to know what to do. So the thinking was that if soy and isoflavones could even slow the growth of those tumors, even slightly, it could have a huge effect on increasing survival from the disease. So we'll see. I hope we find something, but at this point, just can't make any conclusions.
That's a bit frustrating, isn't it? Because there's, from what I gather, strong evidence to certain food groups in the prostate. The green tea, wasn't there? Do you remember, Claire? There was all sorts of foods, but...
Christopher, I did my research actually decades ago on cruciferous vegetables. I ended up freeze drying 1,200 pounds of cabbage. So people were coming by for heads of cabbage all the time. So, you mentioned it's sort of frustrating. I think nutrition is frustrating oftentimes because, especially when it comes to cancer, because you don't have the non-invasive intermediary markers to determine whether you're having an effect on cancer risk or cancer development. Come on, you can feed someone a diet for 3 weeks and measure their blood pressure and cholesterol. And if they go down, you're going to be very excited. You're going to conclude that it probably is reducing risk of of developing heart disease. And that's just not true for a lot of the cancers. And the observational studies, the cohort studies are always important. But in the end, in most instances, in most cases, you're going to need some really solid clinical trials data.
We've talked about soya and cholesterol. Back in 1999, the Food and Drug Administration authorized a health claim that manufacturers could put a claim on products to say that a diet with 25 grams of soya protein may reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. But then there was a follow-up article which was basically criticizing the claim, and we're not even sure whether food manufacturers are still allowed to use that claim. So we wondered if you could update us on where things stood in the US.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. You're correct. 1999, the health claim was approved by the FDA, and then 2007, they came out with a document saying that they were questioning the support for the health claim. And I always say it came out like December 2007, just in time to ruin my Christmas. And then in 2017, they actually said that they may revoke the claim, but they were looking at public comments. And by the way, there were 1,300 comments submitted to the FDA. The FDA was responsible for reviewing all those comments. Many of them, and I won't go into it, but many of them were submitted by one organization that's very anti-soy. What I like to point out was that in terms of safety, so those comments, many of them were claiming that soy foods were harmful, were unsafe. The FDA rejected all of those concerns that were being raised. So that's an important point in terms of the safety of soy food. So they questioned the data in support of the efficacy of soy protein. Now, one of the problems I have with their analysis was that they didn't actually do a meta-analysis. They just looked at whether a particular paper found a statistically significant decrease. If it did, it went on one pile. If it didn't, it went on the other pile. So it was a real binary approach. So you could have gotten a 4% or 5% decrease in LDL cholesterol in response to soy in comparison to the control protein. But if it wasn't significant, perhaps because of the small subject number, it went on the pile that was unsupportive of soy. But more importantly, in 2019, David Jenkins and colleagues from the University of Toronto, well-known researcher, came up with the glycemic index in 1981, actually reevaluated all the data. They looked at all of the studies. They confirmed that soy protein lowers LDL cholesterol about 3 to 4%. And they also saw that the effects of soy protein were constant from those before 1999, 2007, and after the FDA raised concerns. There was no difference, about a 3 or 4% reduction. So it's a small reduction, but it's still relevant, in my opinion, at the patient level and even certainly at the population level. And there's actually a pretty exciting effort underway to secure health claims for soy protein and cholesterol reduction in other regions in the world. And I think we'll be hearing about that within the next year or so, hopefully. So again, I think that you do get a modest cholesterol-lowering effect of soy protein, but then you get the benefit of the polyunsaturated fat. But from my perspective, because of my interest in isoflavones, what I was really focused on was the evidence in the early 2000s showing that isoflavones improve flow-mediated dilation, so endothelial function. And there were also some very interesting studies, one out of Harvard, a randomized controlled trial showing that soy protein lowered blood pressure. So there's some other potential cardiovascular disease benefits of soy beyond cholesterol reduction. Again, I hesitate to make any definitive conclusions, but it's one of these situations where if you've got a modest cholesterol-lowering effect of the protein and healthy fat and great source of high-quality protein and some of these other potential benefits, man, you have to make soy. I mean, you don't have to, but I would advise people making soy part of their diet that's really focused on heart disease prevention, which is the same diet that's going to probably reduce risk of all chronic diseases. And I don't want to forget, in addition to linoleic acid in soybeans, the omega-6 essential fatty acid, soy, along with flax, I mean, great source of the omega-3 essential fatty acid, alpha-linolenic acid. In the United States, amazingly, soybeans and via soybean oil provides over 40% of our intake of both essential fatty acids. And I think it's very possible that the cardiovascular benefits of alpha-linolenic acid, the short-chain omega-3 fatty acid, are probably underappreciated. So, there's so many reasons to incorporate soy into the diet, and it's so versatile and so easy to do so. I mean, I just think everybody concerned about their health, and certainly those focused on a plant-based diet, should try to consume 1 to 2 servings per day. 2 servings is really ideal certainly from an isoflavone perspective, because I mentioned very briefly that most trials intervene with isoflavone doses, but at the minimum of about 40 or 50 milligrams per day. Now, oftentimes they're only using 1 dose, so we don't know if a lower dose would have also been efficacious, but 50 milligrams in 2 servings, it's a reasonable amount. If you're getting 15 grams of protein from that, it's only going to represent maybe 20% of your overall protein intake, so it's not going to focus on one source too heavily. And I don't want to end without mentioning some really exciting skin data. So this has been around for a really long time. I became interested in the field, and we're talking not about topical application, because there's a lot of that, a lot of ingredients, especially from Korea and Asian countries, which are very popular these days, include various soy ingredients in their topical applications. But as a nutritionist, I'm talking about the effect of isoflavones on skin health, overall skin health, hydration, wrinkle reduction. And there are actually 9 studies, 9 clinical trials that found isoflavones improve wrinkles, reduce wrinkles. Now, all of those trials have some design limitations because isoflavones were either combined with other bioactives or the sample size was relatively small. But the most recent trial, published in 2025 or 24, did show was isoflavones by themselves. They showed a 6% reduction in the severity of wrinkles. And that was in response to 50 milligrams of isoflavones.
Sounds great. You're getting those 2 portions in, Claire?
Well, I think you can see I am, can't you?
Our ears are pricked up as 2 ladies in that age group.
I want to come back to the health claims though, because in everything you said, I was like, okay, this is the evidence that Dr. Messina has. But if you were marketing your Messina soya burger or your skin product, are you allowed to put these claims on the product?
In the UK, in the US. I have no idea about the UK, but in the US, for sure.
Okay, right, good. And so we're going to come back to processing of soya. So can we talk a little bit about how processing affects soya? We've also talked about, going to the gym and trying to build muscle where you can get soya isolates and things like that. So can you talk to me about what you think about doing that to soya?
Yeah, so it's not so much processing per se, it's just the product that you end up with. So, there's a big discussion about ultra-processed foods and the NOVA food classification system. I think in the end, you just evaluate for the most part, the content composition of the product and then evaluate its effects on health, regardless of how it's processed. So it is true that you have the traditional Asian soy food, so you can have, eat soybeans like any other pulse or bean. You have edamame, which is very, very popular because the beans are sweeter. They're harvested at about 80% maturity, so it's the same bean, but they're just harvested at they're not allowed to dry out. So, and you have tempeh, which is a fermented product. So these are all whole soybean products. Tofu is a little processed because you get rid of the akara, some of the fiber, but it contains isoflavones and protein and fat. And then you have soy milks. If they're made from whole soybeans, they're going to have fat, protein, isoflavones, and then they're usually fortified with different micronutrients. So what we're really talking about, for the most part, is the difference in these more whole food, traditional soy foods versus these concentrated sources of protein. Just like you would have whey protein. I know in the States, pea protein is really popular these days. You have isolated soy protein. It's about 90% protein, really high quality protein. In fact, we know way more about the quality of these the proteins in concentrated form because they've been studied much more than the protein in tofu or soy milk has. So they're a good source of protein, but they're going to contain a lower amount of isoflavones. They'll still contain isoflavones. They're going to not contain any fiber, whereas some of the whole soy foods will contain fiber. And they're not going to contain fat, so you're losing out on both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. So it's almost a cliche, but I think there's a food that will fit every purpose. I mean, like in general, like you would recommend for any food or overall diet, you want to stick to foods that are less processed, whole foods, maybe in their more natural state. But I'll tell you, I'm not a foodie. I don't cook. I don't eat mindfully. I eat food watching sports most of the time, and I eat as quickly as possible so I can get on with the rest of my life, And fortunately, my wife, Jenny, is a great cook, and I eat what she prepares. But there really is a food for every purpose, and these concentrated forms, enable you to consume wonderful plant-based meat alternatives. In addition to, having soy protein and energy bars, again, maybe that's not the way to have it, but if you want a quick amount, of protein in a convenient form, I mean, I'm very supportive of that. And again, I eat plant-based meat alternatives probably on a daily basis. It doesn't mean that I don't eat beans. I'm just not going to eat beans 3 times a day. I probably have scrambled tofu every single day, and I use soy milk on a regular basis daily. Then I use other products, regularly, but don't want to focus too much on any one food. So I do think these concentrated forms of protein can play a really important role, convenient role. And interestingly, oftentimes when you read articles about raising concerns about soy and breast cancer, you often see at the end a warning about consuming the concentrated sources of soy protein. If you're concerned about soy and breast cancer, that's the opposite advice to give, because these like one very popular soy burger in the United States and other places in the world actually reportedly only contains 2 milligrams of isoflavones per patty. So if you think isoflavones are potentially harmful, but you want to eat soy, that's a product that you could be consuming. So I find it ironic that the advice is always often 180 degrees opposite to what it should be.
That's a really good point. I wanted to ask you about a particular survey of US health professionals that you wrote an article on. That survey showed that beans and lentils, I guess in their unprocessed form, were a top-rated protein source by health professionals. And obviously that doesn't reflect how many people are actually eating. But given that we've got this backlash on these ultra-processed foods at the moment, and we don't tend to consume soya just as a bean in itself. I mean, you can buy the dried bean in the UK, but personally, I haven't done too much with it in that form. How do you think we can protect the idea that eating soya is a healthy activity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I do have a lot of concerns about this focus on ultra-processed foods. I would have thought that the focus on ultra-processed foods would have died out. When I first saw Nova, I think it was well-intentioned, perhaps, developing that system. It didn't make sense to me. I'm not an expert, but it made no sense to me. And yet it continues to be researched to death. And I think in many respects, you could make an argument it's done more harm than good. On the other hand, all dietitians, all health professionals for decades have been emphasizing the importance of consuming less processed foods. I mean, fruits and vegetables. I mean, you much prefer to consume, or it's better to consume an apple than apple juice. I mean, nobody, or certainly than an apple pie. I mean, no one is going to argue with that. So I don't really think that the whole focus on ultra processed foods has been a benefit to the public. I think we're focused on the wrong thing. I do think for people who are really focused on whole foods, you have foods like tempeh. I think it's a wonderful food. It's one of my favorite. And edamame, say in the whole form. Miso, it's probably less likely to be embraced by non-Asians, and often it's very, very high in sodium. I do consume miso, but I think edamame, soy nuts can be really delicious. So there are ways to get soy in its whole form. But I think if you start to think of tofu as being processed, I think you're missing the boat. I think you're focused on the wrong elements of what should be considered to be a healthy diet.
We've covered a lot today. I mean, is there any sort of other myth or anything you really wanted to sort of cover that we haven't done? Anything you think that Soya can teach us more broadly about why nutrition science gets misunderstood, for example?
Yeah, I would just say the thyroid issue is one that has come up over the years. That topic has been researched for almost 100 years. The first animal study was published in 1933. Some of the key work actually came from the UK researchers. The meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials showed that neither soy nor isoflavones affect levels of the two main thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. So I think really that's what you need to know. It is true that soy can inhibit the absorption of thyroid medication, thyroid hormone, but usually you take that on an empty stomach, and there's various recommendations of how long you need to separate the time you take the drug from when you're going to eat foods. So I don't actually think that's a big consideration. In fact, if you are consistent in the way you are using foods, or soy foods in particular, you can actually just titrate the drug so that you get the appropriate blood levels. So that's one. There was one study from the UK that showed, it was a small study that showed a relatively small dose of isoflavones delivered in the form of protein. So 16 milligrams of isoflavones, a little bit more than a half a serving of a traditional Asian soy food, increased the progression from subclinical hypothyroidism to overt hypothyroidism. And so that was a scary study. But that same research group, several years later, published a follow-up study that it was a larger study, larger dose of isoflavones, and they saw absolutely no adverse effects.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, we forgot to mention thyroid. And I think with thyroxine, we always tell people to take it on an empty stomach because there's so many other food groups that also affect the absorption of thyroxine. I don't think that's exclusive to soya, is it?
That's right.
Great. And just moving forwards in terms of any unanswered questions about soya that you think still deserves some research. I mean, you mentioned that you're going to be looking at the omega-6s.
There's two areas that I'd love to see further investigated. One is to actually do a randomized controlled trial looking at the effects of post-diagnosis isoflavone intake in the form of soy foods on breast cancer recurrence and mortality. So actually take women with breast cancer, give half of them a control protein, half of them soy, and see what happens. The other one is this hypothesis that I mentioned that came out in 1995, that early soy intake reduces later risk of developing breast cancer. It's for obvious reasons, it's difficult to study that hypothesis, because if you you can do a retrospective study, which is what has been done. You ask women how much soy they consume when they were younger. You ask the mothers of those women, if they're alive, how much soy they remember their daughters consuming. That's a legitimate type of study, but obviously a prospective study would be superior. But you're talking about getting a group of 10-year-old girls and seeing how many of them eat soy and following them out for 50 years. That's a long study. I mean, those kind of studies have been done, but it's difficult. But I think there are probably some markers, indicators, gene expressions that you can monitor in response to soy consumption in young girls. I would like to see some really smart people take a look at that issue, because if in fact the observational data are correct, and consuming one serving of soy, a cup of soy milk, 3-4 ounces of tofu, can reduce breast cancer risk by 25%, even more than that, according to some studies, that would be a tremendous public health benefit. So it's a difficult one to study. And I don't hesitate. I recommend that all girls consume one serving of soy per day, because it's nutritious and they might get this benefit, but I would like more research on that topic. It's been around for 30 years now, and we just haven't made as much progress as I would have hoped.
Yeah, because something like that could change the school milk system, couldn't it? And have soya milk in schools. I mean, why not?
Yeah. That's a timely point, considering the U.S. just passed a bill that now allows whole soy milk to be included in the school lunch program. And interestingly, it'd be interesting to have someone talk about this, another guest. Because of that bill, the saturated fat content of the whole milk actually doesn't count toward this total saturated fat content of the lunch.
Oh, I've heard this. Yeah.
So, interesting.
Wow. Interesting times, isn't it? Well, we have covered so much, but as our very, very last question, we love asking our guests what their favourite meal is. So given you are the expert on soya, could we ask you specifically your favourite way of eating the soya bean?
You already know my background, so this answer may have no credibility, but probably scrambled tofu. And it's tofu that has added to it a mung bean protein. It's from Just Egg. So it gives it a really wonderful flavor. And I have to admit, I get a kick out of that. So that's probably my go-to product. And then I use a lot of the plant-based meat alternatives because I'm really excellent at microwaving things. So
do you add a bit of black salt to the scrambled tofu for that eggy flavor?
I don't, and now you're going way outside my area of expertise, because to be honest, I've never heard of black salt.
Sometimes called Kala Namak.
Maybe Ginny's heard of it.
I think
she'll have been putting it in your scrambled.
She's really good. Yeah, you're losing me. I'm ready to sign off here.
So yes, thank you very, very much for your time. We've really appreciated having you on the podcast. Thank you, Dr. Messina.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.